So I'm very happy to welcome back to the show, friend of the show and regular guest, Vinay Orekondy. Vinay is an attorney and activist based out of Atlanta. Regular viewers will be very familiar with Vinay. It's always great to talk. Thanks for coming back again.
And thanks for having me on.
So I was hoping to start with a story that I've been covering most weeks, fortunately, and that is the unionization push, the strikes, the labor push going on around the country. And I have a little map here I actually want to show. Should have queued this up before we started the interview. There we go. This is courtesy of More Perfect Union. They track the Starbucks union filings. And I'm just going to quickly scroll down here to the map. You can see all over the country here, down to Hawaii, all across the lower 48. And they list all of them. You can see at the bottom there, they are up to 100 filings for unionization in Starbucks locations around the country. So Vinay, I just was hoping to get your general thoughts. What do you think about this push that we've been seeing over the past recent months?
I mean, it's awesome. I think we can all agree on that it's awesome. But I think that the fact that you've got to win, like that's all we needed. You just needed a spark. We needed one win, right? And the spark was set off, right? And it's going to have huge ripple effects beyond Starbucks, right? Because a lot of other people who are thinking about unionizing in totally unrelated and different industries are going to say, hang on, it's time. We can do this. If they can do it, we can do it. So this is just the beginning, right? I was hoping that that Amazon would have been the spark, but I can see now why it wasn't. Although I actually want to talk about Amazon because I think there's, there's an interesting approach that could be taken there. But there are specific structural reasons why that wouldn't have worked. But we've got our spark, right? So I think, and the fact that it's getting a lot of media attention is excellent. It's just what it's needed. We've got a win. It's getting a lot of attention. It's going to inspire others. So there's not much more to say on that except that it's, I can't wait to see which next industry this hits.
It hits, yeah. And I think you're referring to the wins. I presume in Buffalo. I think 2 of the 3 that filed in Buffalo succeeded. If I have that correctly. Do you think that kind of success rate can replicate itself across the country? I mean, do you think we could see 60 or 70 of these filings succeed?
Look, I don't know. Because it's not unknown territory, but it's we just don't know. So, but I don't think that's. I mean, that's not the central point. The central point is that people are trying, right? Because and the thing is, if they don't succeed, I think people will think, rather than just saying, oh well, it's not possible. I think the instinct will be, let's see why we didn't succeed. Let's evaluate and see how we can try again and succeed next time, right? Because that's all you need is a couple of wins, right? Because and then people start to think, well, this is the norm or this is what it ought to be, as opposed to, like, I remember when just a couple of months back when we were talking about Amazon, and it was almost a question of, is unionizing even possible in this country? This is a test case, right? And that's the way that it was being approached and people were thinking about it. And and I'm glad that even when it didn't work, people didn't give it, but there wasn't that sense that, okay, well, this is possible, right? So even if it succeeds or not in the larger picture, in the individual cases, it doesn't matter. Although obviously we want them all to succeed, but I think from a mentality perspective, what's important is that people will say, okay, we didn't succeed. Why didn't we succeed? Let's evaluate our strategy, shift course as necessary, because unionization is now considered the norm or a possible norm.
Yeah. Part of the norm. Yeah. At least it's not the outside thing. So I'm very curious to hear what you mean about Amazon, but just very quickly, can you talk a little bit about one thing that very much bothers me about some of these battles is when companies, and Starbucks and Amazon are both kind of examples of this, where they like to portray themselves as though they're very like forward-thinking, worker-friendly companies, right? Starbucks calls their workers partners, but just treats them like garbage. So there's this tendency to like engage rhetorically as though you're very progressive about this stuff and pro-worker and whatever. I there's something about that just makes my skin crawl because it's run so counter to the actual treatment of the workers. Can you talk about how, like, what kind of obstacles that presents for organizers and how we can overcome them?
Yeah. That's, in fact, that's quite at least coming from Australia, like I think Australia's a country that doesn't really put up with much linguistic bullshit like that. It's a very kind of blunt culture which laughs at things like that. America, unfortunately, is not like that. America is a
Yeah.
country filled with linguistic traps, right? And where I think, you know, and I think that the question is that, what organizers would have to do is, and I think it's very common among sort of like liberal mindsets, is to use language as your primary means of organizing and
Mm.
and thinking about the world. It's like, well, as long as, if we can. And so, like, I wouldn't be surprised if that some of the people behind some of this like, the HR departments or whatever, say some of them may even be genuinely believing that, look, if we call them partners, that will instigate some sort of change in the organization way of thinking, right? So I think that that's the problem here, is that language is a trap, right? And it can trap people into thinking they're actually doing things when they're not. Um, and more, on a more sinister basis, it's also propaganda, right? So for those who are just know that they're not doing so what organizers need to do is this: is that they just need to bring people back to the facts on the ground and say, okay, well, like, someone calls you a partner. Okay, well then, as a partner, why are you not paid like, uh, you know, why is your fellow partner being paid like, 10,000 times you are, or whatever, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
why is your fellow partner, and so you can use the language against it, right? Saying, well, this implies equality, then why do the facts not demonstrate that? You should demand the equality that they've implied, right? In fact, arguably, you could use that language as a basis for your
Yeah.
organizing and saying, look, there's an implied treatment of equality and of respect here. Why do the facts not match up with that? So let's bring the facts into line. So remind people of the facts, right? And then use that language as saying, as the promise of say, well, this is clearly what Starbucks wants, obviously. Otherwise, they wouldn't have called us partners, right? So,
Hmm.
and then go from there.
And at that point, it's one of two paths. They're either gross hypocrites, or they kind of have to conform to what you're asking for in some sense. Or, that's I really like that strategy right there. That's fantastic. So to pivot to Amazon, I'm curious what you meant there, because I think a similar dynamic, I've talked ad nauseum about. They try to portray themselves as, because they start at $15 an hour, they're progressive. But if you actually look into it, a lot of places around the country, warehouse workers make low to mid 20s per hour. So if Amazon comes in and opens up a facility where they're offering similar work at 15, they're actually dragging wages down, but they get away with that rhetorical, pretending they're actually raising wages and raising the floor. Very similar dynamic with Amazon. I'm curious what your thoughts are on the differences between the Starbucks push and what we saw in Bessemer and what we see now in Staten Island.
Right. So, and you'll have to correct me on this because I'm not really sure. Uh, it's a because question, like, one of the biggest obstacles to unionization is high turnover, right? And
Hmm.
casualization of industry. So, um, unionization tends to be strongest when there's lower turnover, right? Historically,
Hmm.
in industries where like people would stay there for a long time. So that was most industries until about the 80s. And government departments, I guess, even into the 90s, that tend, at least compared to the corporate world, they tended to have, people would stay there longer, so they were easier to unionize, right? So I'd be curious, do you know what the turnover is like at
It's
Starbucks? So that,
excessively high at Amazon. I don't know about Starbucks. Amazon's is incredibly high turnover, though.
right, and that was the point I wanted to bring up. Is that's yeah, I don't know, like that it's ridiculous. Like, in fact, it's like record breaking high in
Hmm.
terms of. And I read an article recently about how there's a concern that Amazon may run out of people to employ
Yeah.
because they've just burned through so many people. Like, I mean, there's only so many people that are, are A, unemployed, and B, willing to work in this kind of conditions, or physically able, or whatever. Like, there's a limit somewhere, right? And the churn at Amazon is so high, especially within localities, that they actually might burn through that and just run out of people.
That's
So
insane.
yeah, it's just like, I've never heard of that before, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But um, So, and the reason of the churn, of course, is because they're physically broken. Like people are like unable to work anymore after like a period of time at Amazon because their joints are busted and like they're,
Mm-hmm.
so it's just um so it's the question then is like, what is that if you've got this very high turnover? And also people just say, well, why am I doing this as well? So it's not just a physical thing, a lot of people just burn out. So what that's presented is an ironic kind of opportunity, is that
Mm.
um, for people who are so like, and the ironic opportunity is that, well, how do you unionize a place like that where there's extremely high turnover? And that's where salting comes in,
Mm.
because if you get people coming into places like that and they say, okay, well, our job is just to stay, right? And they're already going in. And over time, you actually build up a collection of people whose sole purpose is to unionize their workplace, right? And they'll even get promoted because of their longevity, right? So, do you see what I'm getting at? Like, I don't know if I've
Yeah, yeah.
explained it clearly, but if you want to like kind of recap what I'm trying to say for your viewers, because I haven't.
No, no, that I thought you did fantastic. That makes
Okay,
perfect sense, and I
okay,
can see why that would be a major obstacle for organizers if you don't even have, like, during an election you're losing staff and new staff's coming in, and it becomes, you're not organizing this group of people, you're organizing this constantly changing group of people, and that makes it all the more difficult. And what kind of commitment level is a worker going to have if they view it as a short-term job? They're going to be less committed to that organization effort anyway, because they're not thinking this is my future and my community's future. And
right.
I can see why that would present some problems. Do you think there's industry crossover in this way? Like, do you think seeing success in Starbucks might actually be a benefit for organizing Amazon workers, even if they aren't going to succeed, that they might have a better chance in an environment where other industries are seeing some success?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is all connected, right? There's a reason why this is all happening at Starbucks right now. It's because of well, actually, I mean, it's because of all the meta factors going on. Like what have Starbucks workers been subjected to over the last 2 years? Is
Mm-hmm.
they've been called essential workers and frontline workers, and they've been, that all that linguistic stuff, right? That's been going on in the
Mm-hmm.
media, saying these are our heroes who are keeping the economy running, and then treated like dog shit, right? So
Mm-hmm.
and all of this is happening on the back of, you know a conversation that has been changed by you know by Bernie, right? And he had a huge part in shifting the conversation, right?
Right.
And the progressives in Congress have had a huge part in like shifting the conversation, at least, around what should America look like, right? So um, I think all of this is connected, right? So I would say 100%, you're going to see efforts. And the thing is, the strategy I described about like salting is a difficult strategy, because you've got to find
Mm.
a group of people in the locality who are so committed to unionizing a workplace that they're just going to go there, like they're that committed to the idea of unionizing that they're coming in from the outside already with that idea.
Right.
And two, they're willing to, you know, endure whatever bullshit they have to hold on to
Right.
that job. So that is a long term strategy. So I think that places like that are going to take time, but I think that's the best strategy. And we've talked a lot about community building, right, and building
Yeah.
external values based communities that are sustainable and whatnot. That's actually how you do places like that. Like if you've got some sort of external node of people that are together in a community based on their shared values, and they're supporting each other and maybe even living together, that kind of group could develop the sort of solidarity needed to go
Mm-hmm.
and attempt things like salting a workplace and whatnot. But also on a less extreme level, a group like that could just go out and talk to all the chains in the area, or like places that are with a lot of employees in the area, and just talk to them about just assist in unionization efforts, change the conversation locally, go door knocking about unionizing. Like I don't know if that's done in this country, or it's not even done in Australia, because Australia is very much a work organized by workplace. um,
Okay.
I I'm assuming it's similar here, but
Yeah.
like it's not so much. You don't union organize by by suburb or county or anything like that.
Right.
Right,
Well, and
but
there's like you'll see picketers occasionally. I don't think I've ever heard of people like door knocking for unions. That's too bad. I wish there was some more of that. So it's more messaging like we do in other like political areas.
that would have to that requires a shift in thinking, because
Mm,
that's thinking not from a place of, because traditional union thinking obviously comes from I guess from traditional socialist thinking, which is okay, we've got the workers, we've got the bosses, we want to there's a great power inequality, so we want to organize the workers because they have power and can, we can bring something towards equality, right? And that makes sense, and that's been the union model for like, 200 years, right? But as you and I have often discussed, that I think that progressive movement needs towards thinking about localization, right?
hmm.
So, and thinking about physical location and the power of community, right? Obviously, don't get me wrong, unions are communities, right? But um, you know, they're communities that are constantly under threat, that the bosses are trying to destroy, and that
Yeah.
legislatively they have the power to destroy. Like it's very hard to build a community like that when like people are shown videos when they enter about unions of the
Oh my
devil,
gosh.
right?
Yeah.
And where the discussion is, where there's so much fear at it. So it's very hard to build a community like that. So I think and like I'm lucky when I organize in Australia, like we've got a lot of legislative protections for unions. As an organizer, I had a right to walk into a workplace and like people would come and sit with me at lunchtime and and talk union stuff. We wouldn't do it in the open, I would go to but the boss couldn't come and bother me. So these are all either legislatively protected or in the enterprise agreement, right? So that's the kind of you know that's how you build a community. Like you need that kind of protection. So I think unions in the US need to try a different strategy, and that is to build treat unions as almost like the end goal, right? Like that's because there are all these immense challenges, and that the boss's attention is on just stopping the union forming. We need an external source of power, right? That is, we need a community outside of it, and that's why I believe if you build your community outside of that based on geographic location, and that may just simply mean a group of unions in a county who get together and meet and strategize together on a regular basis.
Mm,
But I think it can mean a whole lot more, right? I think it could also mean with like getting together with like groups that share their values on on social issues or racial issues or voting rights issues, or it can bring together like a wider movement into that space. And as you and I have discussed, I eventually foresee those kinds of places becoming like self-sustaining communities with like their own food and things like that, right?
right.
But that essentially what I'm saying is that rather than shifting from the workplace as a starting point, we shift to the locality and common, like the community outside as a node connected by shared values is your starting point, and then that gives you the power to go back into the workplaces very, very strongly, right? And that's why you could do things, and from that kind of mindset, things like door knocking for unions makes a lot of sense, right?
Right. Right.
Because then you're
It's
trying to shift
campaigning, it's
the me-
community building. It's yeah.
yeah, you're trying to shift the conversation in a defined area, right?
Mm,
I'm saying, and then or other strategies start to pop up, like okay, well, you know, um, like for example, this warehouse might is only here because they're like in this community because the community thinks it's like a net good, right? But if the community
hmm.
starts to as it starts to finally get together, because the old discussions, oh, it provides jobs, and maybe
Yeah.
they do, maybe that is the main source of jobs in the area, right? But if the conversation starts to shift, then saying, hang on, maybe they aren't a net good. Maybe the fact that they're paying us like really poorly is not a good thing, and maybe we should be, looking at alternatives. And that puts pressure on the locality or on the local business to or franchise or whatever to get their act together and start improving things. And I've seen this. I've seen this in action. Like I've seen it in when I was living in Vermont, that's kind of how they operate. Like they have the community is a thing there, like it's almost a living, breathing entity, and they've there's a strong relationship between the external community and the businesses there. The communities and the businesses there believe they've incorporated it not just verbally but into their identity. A lot of them are co-ops, you know, and they say,
Mm.
well, like they say, look, our goal, like we literally need to serve the community. Like some of them are member owned co-ops, so that like the people who go and
Mm.
shop there are and so that it draws up those links. You don't see a chain. I mean, you barely see a chain in sight in Vermont. That's another thing. Like a lot of them have tried, but they failed because their business model just didn't work there. So that external community is so important, I think, and it changes because it gives you a source of power that's outside the workplace.
That's really interesting to hear the sort of the cultural societal difference there in Vermont. You kind of mentioned this, but I'm just curious, what was your first reaction to seeing what coming from Australia and that environment for labor organizing, and seeing that, you know, we don't have many of those same kinds of laws on the books that disallow management from union busting, and even the laws that we do have on the books, the NLRB has in many ways been defanged from even enforcing them or doing anything about it. You know, Amazon brazenly broke the rules in dozens of different ways, and it was an essential technicality that they end up having to actually redo the Bessemer situation, right? So it seems like the whole built-in advantage is to allow the union busting, the meetings, the, you know, posters that say vote no and all this kind of stuff. I'm just curious how that compares to your experience in Australia.
I mean, it's completely different. Like it's obviously, you know, the bosses aren't supportive of unions. They don't get me wrong,
Right, right.
and you know, and union density is varies dramatically from company to company, industry to industry. Um, you know, so it's but and I knew it was going to be bad here, but I think I didn't realize quite how bad it is. Like I didn't know that people when they will join a supermarket will be shown an anti-union video as part of their training. Like I didn't like
Hmm.
I was just shocked by that because and I say that as someone who regularly because this was agreed as part of our enterprise bargaining agreement with like so I worked for the bankers union in Australia, right? And by bankers I mean like you know frontline staff and call centers and things like that, not investment
Right,
bankers.
right,
And
right.
um, the I feel I have to clarify that. Once I just said I work for the bankers union, someone was like, "Do bankers need a union?" I was like, "Well, yeah. I mean, they're not that well paid." And I said, "What bankers are you talking about?" It's like then we realized it was thinking about investment
You mean the
bankers.
tellers and the
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So, but the so as part of our enterprise agreement with the bank that with most of the banks, actually most of the large banks, we we go to their inductions, like when new staff are inducted, and at the end of it, we have a scheduled spot where we can recruit people to the union
Wow.
and we can hand out materials. And you know, there's a little bit of most of HR like are quite professional about it as well. Like they'll just and they say now it's time to. I had one person who like um you know was kind of unprofessional about it and was like kind of you know because I gave quite a full speech about joining the union and it's like you know we're together and they said well you know that's not the only way you can be together because we're kind of together as a company like as I walked up and I was like oh my god like at least let me leave first you know like but you know when I hear that the equivalent here is a HR will show you a don't join the union video instead of
Yeah.
like the organizer getting to come in and recruit. And as I said, don't get me wrong, this is not because of the goodwill of the companies. That's because of 100 years of unions fighting
Yes.
for
Yes.
like and organizing and like having the power to negotiate those enterprise agreements and you know and know it and because the things that they know that like like Australian unions have used their power effectively in the past. So and like that's why like you know there's a cordial I mean, if we're able to have like a good relationship, you know, or a decent relationship with the bosses, where it's actually a decent negotiation. But that's because we've used our power, and they know that,
Mm,
right?
mm-hmm.
So like you can both sit equally at a table, but sometimes you have to like prove that you're equal first, right?
Mm-hmm.
That means showing you've got power. So the question here is like, how do we build that power? And that's a tactical and strategic question. So, and like, yeah, coming to America, it felt like, all right, I'm kind of at square one. How do I go back like 100 years and like, how do we get to that point of building power? And, and it's like, well, do we need, what were the conditions that brought it about in Australia? I think there's a couple of things. You know, I think one,
And what
Australians
timeline was
always.
this on? Was you said about 100 years ago? When did this push kind of start in Australia?
So yeah, like I would say, or more than that. I think Australia's always had a like a sort of a union friendly culture. Like there's a famous incident in the history of the labor movement globally. It's called the Eureka Stockades, and so where like it was in the 1800s, where like a group of like labor workers like put at these stockades. I'll actually don't know the details of it. I will next time I'm on. I'll come and find the details for you. But basically, we had a lot of like labor organizing in our history, and I think also you may have heard of Ned Kelly. I don't know if you've heard of
It
him.
doesn't ring a bell. Who's Ned Kelly?
Okay, he was a he wasn't a unionist, but he was a bush ranger. So he famously um, he was essentially like a Robin Hood, but a real life Robin Hood. Um, in he like there was actually a few movies made about him, but he wore like like a essentially he was dressed like the Mandalorian. Like he was dressed
Oh
in this
my
like
gosh.
metallic outfit. Like he put a can on his head. Like it only happened. This was like the incident, like the most famous incident where he was captured. But he was dressed in this like metallic outfit and had a shootout with the cops. And
Oh
he'd
boy.
essentially been robbing banks and then like clearing people's debts as well, and and like giving money to the poor. And so he's a very very famous like legend in Australian history. And he there are debates about whether he was a criminal or whether he was a revolutionary, but and at one point like he actually had like put together this like proposal for a new republic of Australia. This all happened in the 1800s, like
My
the
gosh.
and so like it's what I'm saying is that, and before that obviously Australia had a convict culture, and I think that's the heart of it, is that Australia's convict culture has given it a like this strong sort of anti-authoritarian sentiment, um,
Mm.
which has made union organizing much more possible, right? Whereas America is built on this very individualistic sentiment. And I don't want to say this to
Mhm.
dishearten you, because I'm just talking about why there's a difference, right? It's
Right,
that
right.
like America's built on this idea that like I think a lot of so in fact Australia and America, like they're both sort of like British colonies, right? So you'd think they'd be quite similar, and they are. They have a lot of similarities, but I think the major things that distinguish Australia are, one is the convict culture, and two, just the absolutely destructive nature of the environment. Like, so there's like a lot of environmental disasters and things. So what both of those things have created like a sense of community. So you'll notice in Australia, whenever there's an environmental disaster, people will just come together just like that. Like even though
Oh,
like they don't even hesitate. Like people who don't know each other, neighbors, they'll just come together just like that, and they'll help each other out. They'll feed each other. They'll just it's really strong solidarity. And I think that's imbued in the national DNA because it's such a harsh environment, right? And so I think both of those two things, both the convict cultures, like the convict sort of coming together against the against the people that put them there, essentially the the, the prison masters. But you also add in World War I, where the Australian soldiers were kind of under the command of the British, right? So that
mm.
kind of and there's this sort of this thing came out of World War I of like the the Australian soldiers having like camaraderie and solidarity, and fighting bravely, while the British generals were like sitting far behind the lines, drinking and so they
Right.
kind of fed into this sort of anti-authoritarian sentiment.
I
Um,
see.
and I think all of those things together have created that spirit, and that's why I can't like it's. This is why the whole Bernie phenomenon is just so interesting to me. I mean, obviously, I worked for him, but like as an American thing, because this is very unique. Like it
Mm.
just, um, it's it's it cuts against so much of how America thinks. So, and I think that naturally a settler society like a British colonial society, the attitude here, instead of like people coming together, it's been like, well, you know you prove your worth to the community, or just die. Like I think that was the sort of the attitude in, like, and that kind of came with the whole, like, with the like the old Protestant work ethic that was brought in. It's like, if you're not contributing to
Right,
this
right, right.
community, or like if you're not working hard, we're not going to feed you, right? So just,
Mm.
you're not worthy of living. I think that was and that's also an attitude that I guess can come with like winter scarcity, right? Um, so I think like a lot of, essentially what it's happened is that America's become the society which is like, you either like it's sink or swim, right? You either
Yeah, yeah,
like
yeah.
work yourself to death, and then you'll become a billionaire or whatever. Otherwise, just die. Like that's
Yeah.
the heart of it. So
It's a
so
meritocracy on steroids is what it kind of amounts to. We like to think of that as a positive, like as though that means you've earned and there's
right,
some
except,
sort of value placed on it.
well, and the idea that hard work also equals financial success is
Mm-hmm.
the other thing as well, which is insane in modern America, because you see people working like, you know like 4 jobs, and like, just and having several kids at the same time. Like they're
Barely
working
can
harder
afford
than
their rent.
anybody.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
they're working harder than anybody, right? And so
Yeah.
that's another problem you've got here. But I guess that was sort of more broadly theorizing about the difference between why Australia has a culture of labor and America does not. But I don't say all that to dishearten you. I say it because like that's history. But
Yeah.
America is so poised for a transformation right now. It's like
Mm.
everything I'm seeing is like lining it up. Like, you know, you've got the negative conditions that are often required, right? Like clearly things have just gotten worse, right? The you've got external sources of power. You've got like people like Bernie and like talking about this now, so that ideas that like were just totally horrible to talk about, even several years ago, are now okay to talk about. It's normal to talk about. Like socialism isn't a dirty word anymore, really, at least comparatively.
Right.
Um,
Well, certainly for younger generations. Yeah.
yeah, like let's see if he lives up to it. But Joe Biden has talked about like being the most pro-union president ever, right?
Yeah, that's
Let's
rhetoric that
that's
wouldn't have even flied during the Obama administration. I mean, I
right.
think you're right. That's a shift in, yeah.
Yeah, and obviously, we can't fall into the trap of seeing language as reality, but
Of course,
there
of
is a
course. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
but there is a link, right? There is a link between language and reality, right? And like language can shift reality.
Mm.
So, and I think, and like the language of politics has shifted the reality, right? Because you have progressives who have gone out there using the political stage and have talked so much about these ideas, and that they're now normal,
Yeah,
or
yeah,
they're normal to talk about. And
yeah.
arguably, even more interestingly, and I think, is that some of these ideas are filtering into the right. you know
Mm-hmm.
they won't use the same language. They'll talk about lashing out against globalists, and
Right.
but
The
they have
elites.
the, yeah, and but it's the same, like, one, they've got the same target, and two, they'll are annoyed at wealth inequality. They won't call it, say, wealth inequality, but they'll be annoyed that that Jeff Bezos exists and is using has lots of money to throw around, while there are, people that they're trying to appeal to do not. So
Mm-hmm.
so it's interesting. So I think a lot of and I think you and I have actually discussed this about how a lot of like unions are actually well poised to like capitalize on both sides of the political aisle. But yeah, like things are ready to like really escalate here, and I couldn't be more excited.
Do you see a link politically, and obviously this is all kind of connected, but I'm curious, like it seems like in this country there is a lack of political support. Like I'm in Australia, I guess I'll ask it this way. Is there a major party in Australia that like pretty genuinely supports unions? Because it seems like in the United States, the Democrats are not so, we have two parties that largely represent the ownership and managerial class on the by and large, with the Bernie exceptions and that kind of a thing. But I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are on the, how that might impact the culture and the unionization efforts.
Yes and no. So, and this is actually something I should have said earlier when we were talking about the differences between Australia and the US, is that we have a one of our two major parties is the Labor Party, right? And
Mm-hmm.
the unions actually have a controlling vote in the Labor Party.
Oh my gosh, that's a huge difference from the U.S.
Right, and the Labor Party was formed in 1900 or thereabouts, like in the late 1800s, early 1900s, right? So we've had 100 years of one of our two parties being union dominated, right?
Mm.
So that is obviously a huge difference because whenever they've taken power, they've obviously taken pro-union steps. The reason I say yes and no is because, unfortunately, the Labour Party has become essentially like the Democrats, right?
I
Um,
see.
and it's and you think, how is that possible if they're union dominated? It's because something happened. Like it's because it's complicated, but like even the unions themselves aren't quite what they used to be in Australia because they've all become like almost like they've kind of become a feeder into parliament. So people who want to get like go into parliament, like they sort of plan their political career, they'll join Young Labour in university, um, and like in fact, this happens regularly. They'll join Young Labour in university, then the next track is to go, get a management role in a union, maybe even like rise up in the union, and then they'll be like put into a safe seat somewhere, and then they can jockey for power inside Labour, and then hopefully maybe they'll get to be prime minister one day, right? So like the unions themselves have become managerialized, if that makes sense,
Mm. Mm-hmm.
because they were centralized. So they've lost their grassroots power and they've been or institutionalized. That's the word I was looking for. Now that's changing. Like, and don't get me wrong, there are some brilliant union activists in Australia. Like the nurses union in particular is this incredible union. I met in my union, the finance sector union, despite being a bankers union, right? And it's I met some amazing activists, and there were a, a lot of the people in the management there I were fantastic. So I'm just talking about a more general phenomenon inside
Mm-hmm.
the movement, um, that you have seen, right? Especially in terms of its relationship with the Labor Party, right? Is that you will have people who kind of like go up the ranks for the purpose of entering politics. And so that's killed the grassroots power, right? But it's changing because you're starting to see a lot of grassroots power returning.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, um, interestingly, like it seems to, I don't know if this is an accident, but the union power seems to be, and grassroots power specifically, is growing in unions dominated by women. Um,
Oh.
and they happen to be like the best activists. Like, and it could be a coincidence, but it could also be something about the changing nature of like managerial and institutional power.
Mm-hmm.
Because, like as I said, the best union in Australia, hands down, is the nurses union, right? Um, they've got a really high density, very active. They don't hesitate to switch between politics, and like they're like also, and they will go door knock for the Labor Party, right? Like despite all the problems with the Labor Party, they will go door knock for them, and and they're just a machine. And they have produced a number of we have the Australian Council of Trade Unions, like the peak body, and so a number of the recent ones have come from the Nurses Union. And so, but there's an interesting, and there's some other phenomena that are happening as well, which I'll get into there. But I think that what happened with Labor, the party, and also what happened with institutionalization of the unions is the sort of thing that happens to the Democrats. Really, is it sort of you got during the 90s, you sort of got a group of sort of old men really with money or right, that that kind of could have equally been in the management of a corporation, but instead for whatever reason took this track, right? So I think that's sort of what happened. But and I think it's a lot of it's possible that they kind of ignored a lot of these industries that were female dominated, and that's why, as a consequence, they've really developed their grassroots power.
I see.
And develop. That I'm just theorizing, but that would
that would make perfect sense. That follows, right? That you suppress this group for so long, and then when it becomes they're more culturally relevant, it would make sense they would hold a great deal of power. I'm curious, in the United States, do you think I wonder if Biden's some sort of inaction in other areas might also drive people to unionize and find identity and solidarity in that way. Also just the material well-being of people is not impacted well by inaction. So when Biden, for example, promises to cancel large portions of student debt and does hardly any of it, even though we all know he has the authority to do so, when Biden refuses to make improvements to the healthcare system, even though the Social Security Act gives him the options to do these kinds of things, do you think those end up impacting a populace that maybe put faith in the political process and is now kind of looking at it like, I'm going to take it into my own hands locally and I'm going to unionize and organize with my coworkers and that kind of a thing?
100%. I mean, it has two effects, actually. Is that for those that still are willing to believe in the political process, it forces them to organize even more. Because in their mind, the answer is, well, we need more power, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like an analogy might be like, progressives inside the Democratic Party, right? Like a lot of the ways they think is that, well, we just need to keep taking over the Democratic Party, right? So, and I think that's a valid strategy. It's not enough, but it's a valid and important strategy, right? But there's also those, who will say, well, forget the Democratic Party, it's useless, right? We need to, either some will say we need to start third parties, some will say we need to organize a ranked choice, others will say forget politics altogether. And and those are all different approaches. And I think that those approaches will also, they're even more, let's take things into our own hands, right? They are about because they're expecting nothing from above. They're or expecting above to make things worse. So they would definitely try and push to do things on the ground, right? So so in other words, the effect of nothing happening on the federal level is a lot of organization in both those who still believe and those who don't. Right? So I'm optimistic, actually, when it comes to the organizing front.
That's this is one of the few areas I feel like I get up here and do a few hours every Sunday and it's all pessimistic and downer stuff. I'm talking about the world's gonna burn and you know what I mean, Democrats didn't do something again, and it's all negative, pessimistic stuff, except for this union push. And I've made a point to do a labor segment every week because that does bring me some inspiration and hope, and I think the left needs that. So I also wanted to, this is just a total pivot, but we kind of stumbled upon this topic when we were talking before the segment here today, about some of the visceral responses to certain issues, like critical race theory was the one that we were talking about, and some of the cognitive dissonance that you find when people seem to perhaps hear something from their favorite commentator or pundit or podcaster that really is not at all attached to the theory itself or the literature itself, and yet people respond quite viscerally and authoritatively on these kinds of topics. So I was curious what your thoughts are on that phenomenon. Is that somewhat uniquely American? Is that in your experience, or is that a sort of a worldwide political phenomenon?
It's worldwide, but it is particularly concentrated here. Like it's particularly
Hmm.
strong here. But it definitely happens in Australia too. There's no doubt about it. Um, and for me, it's actually so I used to get really annoyed, and for the same reason, like people would just sort of like talk about things they don't know about and talk authoritatively on it. And it's not because I did, but I'm willing to defer to those who do know what they're talking
Right.
about, right?
Right.
And uh, or I would actually take the time to try and like know something. But and as I said, that used to really annoy me when people do that. And but now I'm starting to understand, well, why did that happen? Why is this happening? And I
Hmm.
think it's because we've given people some of the power to be part of the national discourse, but not all of the power. And like what this country in particular is built on, like obviously it's heavily stratified. Like this country is really stratified into classes, right? But the way it's done right now, a lot of it is by holding knowledge to ransom, right?
Mm.
And by knowledge, I like, and obviously that that requires some qualification, because technically all knowledge is available on the internet, um, but knowledge means includes things like qualifications, the piece of paper. It includes the culture of critical thinking, the culture of universities, the way of thinking about things, right? That comes from there. Um, it includes the entire culture around knowledge, right? And um, and what we've done is we've given the entire world social media. Everyone can be part of the conversation now, but we haven't let go of that very kind of fairly restrictive culture around knowledge. So we should totally expect people to like push back against it, right? Because essentially, like social media has given people power that they didn't have before, right? So they're going to use it, right? They're
Yeah.
going to use it
Yeah.
for better or for worse, and we've seen both, right?
Yeah.
Um, and as it's and I really mean for better or for worse, because like the entire Arab Spring was
Right. Of
because of
course.
social media, right?
Yeah.
But also, like the whole anti-vaxxer phenomenon, people just spreading bullshit on social media. It's all part of it. And so we've given people power, but we haven't given them empowerment, right? So
Mm.
and and it's because that's it's by holding on to knowledge and like keeping it to yourself and making it inaccessible. So it's very hard to go to college here in this country. It's extremely hard, right? Because it's prohibitively expensive. um, that is how people maintain power. And I think that knowledge thing is going to be increasingly important, because this is increasingly a knowledge based economy, right? Where technology companies dominate, right? So having like specialized skill sets and like how to like especially technological ones, or how to then even the knowledge of how to navigate systems like political systems or legal systems and all of that. Like law is actually an early example of this stuff, right? That's been around for hundreds of years. A group of people who have this very complex yet necessary thing, and they essentially form a guild around it, make it impossible to enter,
Yeah.
right? And then maintain power by the virtue of having that knowledge that nobody else has. And but that knowledge is necessary for society to function. So tech companies are doing that as well, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so of course people are going to push back against it. Of course they are. And if you're not privy to that culture of knowledge, you're often going to be wrong. Yeah, and yes, but I think that the resentment, like, because essentially what this is it's part of the class war, right? Um, and with and it's unfortunate because knowledge is not the same as like not it's like when you make an argument, it's better to be correct than not correct, right?
Right. Right.
Anti-vaxxers, when an anti-vaxxer posts bullshit online, people die because of that, right?
Yes.
Like, so it's not a good thing. Like, even though I'm framing it as like as part of a class war, like it's not a good thing this is happening, right?
Yeah.
And so, I think that like how do we and you can see and it's not strictly a class war either, because it's you know like a lot of the people who engage in like conspiracy and are very middle class. They're very middle class, right? It's and so they may not and they might be well off financially, right? Like it's not, they just might not be part of the the culture of knowledge, the elite culture of knowledge, right? So someone can be like a well-off businessman, right? That's done well in their community or whatever, that either never went to university or something like that, right? Like, and there's a lot of people like that. A lot of small business people have done well, right? And actually, that makes up a good portion of the Trump base, right? Is they're a lot more middle class than we realize. Like, look at the Capitol rioters. A lot of them are actually reasonably well off. Could afford to fly to DC during a pandemic, right?
Right.
So what I'm saying is that knowledge is held at ransom, and I think that that's caused all these problems, right? So
Mm.
I think it's caused, like, because it's sort of like, say, well, it's almost like it's created its own class system which isn't financial per se. It's like, it's almost like you've got the high priests of knowledge, right? And then everyone else should bow to them. And unfortunately, that's kind of how we've treated science as well. As much as I'm absolutely someone who defers to scientific expertise, the problem is we've created a culture where we've got to bow to the high priests. So,
Yeah.
and that's the problem of how we've like disseminated knowledge. I don't know if
So
this
do
is
you?
making sense. Yeah,
Yeah, 100. Do you, correct me if I'm wrong in sort of summing this up, but the content may matter less than sort of the perception of the people who hold it, and that can create um, a
that's it.
distrust, I suppose, for the institution, and then the content becomes kind of irrelevant, and you're working backwards now from how you feel about the institution.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of those feelings about the institution are very valid.
Hmm.
People, like, for example, whenever I've like talked to people anti-vaccine, they're like, the first thing I'll say, oh, you're a fool to trust pharmaceutical companies. Look at
Yeah.
how they're like. And I was like, I don't trust pharmaceutical companies, right? I wouldn't, like, I know like they're vicious things, but I do trust peer review, right?
Yes.
And I think that the concept of peer review and the whole like, and I've been exposed to the concept of peer review since high school, right? I've been lucky that way, right?
Hmm.
But that's part of that kind of culture of knowledge, right? And a lot of people just aren't aware of it or understand that how that is largely severable from from the marketing and sort of product development side of a pharmaceutical company. Why? Because it's independently verifiable, right? That's the
Hmm.
difference. But that's such a it's like it requires so much like thinking about science and how science works. Like people say, there's a really common meme you might have seen about like scientists will agree with whoever's paying them, right? I'm sure you've seen that meme. And I was like,
Yeah, I've seen that.
well,
Yep.
yeah, and it's like, well, actually, if they, that's not how it works. Because if they publish
Yeah.
bullshit, right, then someone from the competing company which company stands to benefit from calling out that bullshit will do so, or from
Yeah.
the like countless other scientists who don't work for any of them. It's like that's how the free market works. They tear each other apart, and they actually benefit from like disproving each other's research because it gives their company a leg up. And also, if you're like a hospital or something that wants to treat your patients, you're not just going to like, you're going to spend money on this stuff. You're not just going to buy like because you're not
Garbage.
just going to yeah, you're not just going to trust because big pharma said it or something. You actually are going to like talk to independent scientists, right?
Yeah.
There's a really strong culture of independence that people just don't understand. And ironically, that's one of the benefits of the free market in this context is that scientists tear each other down all the time. They do. They argue with each other. They're like lawyers. They're possibly more so than lawyers. That's all they do is they rip each other apart and try their hardest to disprove each other, and
Yeah.
that's why it works.
Yeah.
So, but again, it's only if you kind of get that how, and that's because if you're not part of that culture, you've never been exposed to that, you're just going to think scientist works for a big pharmaceutical company who has done dodgy things, therefore I shouldn't trust anything that comes from it.
That
Right.
is such a
So,
good point. That's such a good. And you point the money meme, right? The whole like they're gonna go with whatever they're paid to say. Well, okay, then how do you explain, like, for example, that mRNA technology has been researched for like 20 or 25 years, largely in public institutions and reputable universities? Where's your perverse incentive structure there? You know what I mean? I think there's
right.
an ignorance of how it all operates. Obviously, like if we're talking about the cigarettes battle and you have some, you know, scientists paid by Marlboro. Yes, I don't necessarily trust that. Like, we can all, there's nuance there, but I think you're right. There's this lack of understanding of how the whole system itself is quite skeptical of itself, and that creates a sense of integrity and a sense of principle.
Right. Right. And then there's also and if you think about it's problematic though that you kind of have to, and I don't know what the solution is, but that you have to kind of be inducted into that class in order to be able to challenge it. Like, but that's the truth. That's how
Mm,
science works. Like, I'm not qualified to think about, because I'm not inducted.
right.
Like, I haven't studied biotechnology. I'm not you know able to challenge
Yeah.
that stuff, right? That's why I will
Yeah.
listen to a majority of scientists. But
Yeah.
and but that's created these silos of knowledge, right? And I'm someone who's been lucky to have a good education, right? I got
Right.
to do law, right? And I'm not part of that group, right? So we've got all these little silos of extra specialized information that the majority of the world isn't privy to. So
Mm,
if the institutions that are propping them up, and that's the unfortunate truth that science, as it does require money, are misbehaving, are too powerful, then of course that the silos that they prop up are not going to be trusted either, right? So the question then is and I think that that's why we have to start to move the discussion away from well, first is that's why I often start with those vaccine discussions. I've stopped having them recently, but um, it would be like, I don't trust pharmaceutical companies either, but I do trust scientific process, which is separate. So we have to be able to separate the institution from the knowledge, right?
hmm
And if there are valid reasons not to make that separation, such as within government departments, for example, that's why
Sure.
you know it's stuff that comes out of the government, it's a there's less of that separation, right, between the institution and the knowledge that comes out of it, then yeah, fair enough. But what for me the ultimate, like well, I mean, this is the problem that we're facing. I mean, I think a lot of the solution in my eyes is the dissolving of those institutions and not the destruction, but um, the what's the word I'm trying to say?
I think you said earlier, like,
Uh,
democratizing the knowledge, I think, is kind of a way to put it.
right, and the institutions themselves, right?
Yeah.
So going towards things and this is where things like unionizing comes in, right? Because or moving towards co-ops, right?
hmm
Moving towards um, I think the death of the mega corporation, I think, is a good thing. I think that
hmm
one of the big trends, economic trends to see, is that giant companies may end up, it may become more efficient over time to just contract, just to be marketing departments, and then have lots of contractors along the supply chain, right? Um, and it's lots of small companies that actually make up, that's, I mean, that's kind of how fashion companies, for better or for worse, do operate already. It's often just marketing departments, right? They're with 100 people, like Calvin
Yeah.
Klein, it's 100 people, but they're every stage is another company, right, that operates.
They just throw
So
their label on it and yep.
Yeah, and I think like obviously that's there are many problems with the fashion industry, but one thing that I think is good out of it is that you don't have these giant institutions dominating per se, right? And I think that's maybe how we move towards the like dissolving of these giant institutions and the democratizing of knowledge, because then you've got lot more players that are required to know how the whole process works, and that gives more ownership, right? So it's a flattening. It's a flattening of these structures. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and you think that can address some of the distrust there, and I mean, I'm not necessarily saying immediately, but maybe over a generation or two of having a better situation, that distrust could evaporate.
Yeah, absolutely. And like for me, there's nothing will be more powerful than co-ops, right?
Mm,
Because where you have like and the spirit behind co-ops is where people are given ownership, right? People don't trust knowledge because they have no control or ownership or exposure to it, right? But you give them, if you find a way to like give them some part of the process, um, and that might mean, okay, I'll give an example. Like, let's say part of vaccine manufacturing, like I'm just totally making this up, so it could be completely wrong, right? But like, let's say vaccine manufacturing is like split up into like lots of different subcomponents, and it's done all over the United States and starts producing jobs. And there are lots of little co-ops that do different parts of it, right? What you'd see is like a lot more ownership over the manufacture of vaccines, right?
mm.
Um, I'm not saying that's possible or anything. As I said, I don't know enough about how vaccines
But
are
theoretically, yeah.
manufactured. Yeah, but what I'm saying is that if you can break up institutions and give people ownership in every possible way people can be given ownership, whether it be like, through literally giving them ownership in the form of cooperatives, or, their small enterprise has part, everyone in it is a part to play in a larger process. All of this is flattening and decentralized. That was the word I was looking for, decentralization. Yeah.
Hmm.
Decentralize processes, you decentralize power, all of this lead, I think, toward increased trust because people have more power over the larger process and they need to understand it. And they have a role to play, right? It's not like I'm here to go and like listen to the beck and call of my knowledge master over there. Rather, this
Right, right,
is I'm
right.
going to play my equal and necessary part in this process that serves society, right? Um,
So to circle it back, you mentioned the co-ops. Unions may be a perfect example of that, right? An institution that can kind of bring things down to the local community, and instead of having to sort of go to this abstract institution that you're trusting for all of your knowledge or information, you're actually empowered. You're actually, you're fighting for your livelihood with your community instead of it being we have to trust this thing that we've been taught to.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, that's a good segue actually back to the to what we were discussing earlier, because one of the other problems of knowledge we've got is that it's because we're in this individualized society, right? You know, what's happened is that those who have a megaphone, like so, imagine like we're all like lots of little dots, right? And then anyone like that are disconnected from each other, like we're atomized in this sort of post Reagan world, right? That
Hmm.
means that anybody who's got a loud megaphone or who's got more resources has an unusually large influence, right? But because they're talking to all these atomized individuals, does that make
Mm.
sense? Like because,
Yeah.
but if you've got communities where information can spread within them, then then and you don't have like people with such huge megaphone comparatively anymore. Instead, you've got like groups, right? Then that can be like a way of mediating the difference between the individual and these very large institutions. So, and that's a class to make this real. It's how organizers working with churches have always operated, right? Like an individual alone will,
Right.
might believe anything they go on the internet, but then the pastor will say, okay, this is a good thing, and they'll influence the group, and that's why a lot of organizers work with pastors, right? Because they're a really great example of an influential
Basically what
community
they do.
leader.
Proselytization is organizing in a sense. I mean, it's basically what they do. It's, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I've worked with pastors as well.
Right.
Interestingly, even in like very Republican areas, right? Like one of the projects I worked on past was like we were getting churches to support debt relief for third world countries,
Oh my
and
gosh.
yeah, and there were these people in heavily Republican districts were like supporting it because it was like it's a concept in the Bible of Jubilee of debt cancellation, and it's a so my point is that like leadership, like communities, like and based on shared values, leaders in those communities, they're really good mediating influence, I think, between gigantic institutions that have too much power and hold on to knowledge and the individual. You need something in between. Community is that thing in between, right? And good leaders, good community leaders, are the thing in between.
Right.
So I think that's how we'll help get over part of that problem, right? And eventually you want those communities to take the next step and become like economic entities that are like actually like have a part in that process, but that's down the track.
Yeah. So, and one more thing here. I don't want to take up too much of your time, and this might be a question that we could go on about for another fucking hour. But I just quickly, do you think what role does the media have in this? Because I think that distrust for the media as an institution is also a major factor in this, and plays into that perception of the elites with the knowledge, and what role do
Yeah.
you see the media playing, and how can we maybe I don't know, improve the infrastructure itself so that it is. I'm not just trying to get people to trust a bad institution. I want to improve the institution so that people trust it more organically and righteously, right?
Ironically, I think the media is actually the first place that this is happening because
Mm,
they've been under assault from social media existing, like, and now independent media as well. And I think this is all good things. Like, all the ratings are falling for the there's large media companies, right?
yeah.
And I think that's a good thing. Like so what has happened is that um the people have been given like literally it's actually the like people have been given a platform to connect to each other instead of requiring the person with the megaphone to be the connector, right?
Mm-hmm.
I.e. social media, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a model for the first step in the creation of community. And second is out of that alternatives are forming. So then that you apply that model in every industry, right? Not just the media, like you apply it everywhere. Like it's the same model is you give people a way to connect to each other so they're not reliant on the person with the resources or megaphone or whatever. So you give them a way to connect to each other. And then from those connections, alternatives must form.
Mm-hmm.
So I think actually the irony is that the media is actually a really good example of what we should be doing, right? Of how we change this. Now, having said that, um, you know, it's not all going to be good because what
Right.
has come out of this is like really fucked up alternatives as well, right?
Yes.
Like that's why, but that's just there's nothing like that's part of the process. Like, and I think that
Mm-hmm.
you know we can try and suppress stuff, but I think that just we're
It
all we
doesn't.
did was it just doesn't work. Like we
Yeah.
pushed people to the dark web before, and like like, and I think it's often like a very that's one of the issues I've got with um some of the more extreme parts of like cancel culture and things like that. Like I don't I don't know if I'm not sure how I feel about all of it because I think all you're doing is just pushing it under, and it will find a way to express itself, and it'll usually be worse when it does that.
Well, you're kind of reinforcing what we were just talking about, that perception of the elites. You're reinforcing that, right? If
Right.
someone is enjoying content and you go censor that content, you're actually just proving to that person that, you know what I mean, that you want this stranglehold over the knowledge and information, and that just
That's it.
reinforces their
That's it.
position.
That's it. That's it. So we've got to yeah, and I think we've actually got to encourage more alternatives, even ones that we don't like or don't agree with, and like um you know that's and obviously I'm sure you're in the media, like you've been following this whole Rogan thing. Like,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the stuff he says is very problematic, but I think that, he's also someone who has shown he can like reflect and backtrack, right? And I think that's what we've got to seize on.
Yeah,
Is
with Rogan, I think it's genuine ignorance. I don't necessarily think of him as like a malicious actor. I think he's done some irresponsible things. He's platformed some people he really should not have platformed, and that's done, tangible harm. But to your point, like I don't think you're actually addressing the problem you think you're addressing if you try to censor him. That it's not going to have the intended effect that you think it does.
right, and I think that like if someone gives an opportunity to engage, right, you take
Yeah,
it, and he gives that, like, and he's shown that he's like he can reflect and change his opinion, and that's something we
right.
absolutely need to encourage everywhere on our own side, everywhere, like, is because that's what engagement looks like, right? Is a willingness to like think about and reflect. It doesn't mean like, well, I'll listen to everyone and like everyone's correct, but engagement means like, okay, well, these are my values, these are your values. Is there enough common ground for us to even have a discussion, right? Like, I'm not
Mm-hmm.
going to, just because I believe in engagement doesn't mean I'm going to start talking to a Nazi, right? Like,
Right.
but it does mean that I can talk to someone who's conservative, right? And and it means, and engagement also means like, and that means like, okay, do you have a right to exist? Yeah, you do, right? I don't think you're right, I think you're wrong, but do you have a right to exist? You do. And that I think is going to be a real challenge for us, especially on the left. Like, and by the left I mean like kind of, the sort of the liberal institutional left, right? Because I just
Broad
don't
left.
think
Yes.
that,
Yeah.
yeah, I actually think like leftists, progressives are, and leftists are generally better at like, um, at being okay with the existence of people with very different
That
points of view.
disagree. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
um, but I think that, you know liberals are going to struggle with it, and they've shown they struggle because that I think that their methodology is the very thing that has been a theme of our discussion today, which is the institutional power over knowledge, and then like, and those that deviate have got to be cut off. And I think there's a misunderstanding by the opponents of that. They say, oh, they say that's the elites trying to cut down. No, it's actually not. I mean, it might be, but it's also, a big, large group of, people who also believe in this stuff who are participating in it. Like, so cancel
Right.
culture is, that's actually, tech is a grassroots thing, right? But and people don't understand that it's not just this elite plot. It's actually like,
Right.
often it's like a lot of people on Twitter like getting worked up about something,
Right.
but it's just, it's not a good strategy. Like, it's just, so, and there's a place for it. Like, don't get me wrong, like, I've participated in that. Like,
Yeah. I was.
I've
Yeah.
I've run advertiser boycotts against people. It's not a bad thing. It's just, but it can't be your only strategy, right?
Right. Right.
There is a role for engagement, and and this again, I think, is part of the role that progressives have got to play. Is that like, we've got to say, look, okay, you know, institutions, because we believe institutions should dissolve and decentralize, right? And we've got to say, in the process, it's going to bring up actors that we don't agree with,
Right.
right? And more
Unsavory.
of them.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and extremist ones too, and that's unfortunate. But
Yeah.
but it's, as a as a Buddhist, I believe that the world is a collective consciousness figuring itself out. So we've got to kind of let this all play out. We've got to let society figure itself out. You can't repress a conversation. You have to let the conversation happen to, in a sensible manner, but you've got to,
Right.
and a respectful manner, but it still has to happen at some point, right?
Yeah.
So,
Absolutely. Well,
and it
I know
can't
I
just
framed the
happen
last
at the
question
university.
one more time on that one.
It can't, and it certainly can't just happen inside a university. Like,
Oh
that's the
yeah,
worst
no,
thing.
yeah. Again, that reinforces the exactly. So I know I had framed that last question like the last one, but this brought up another thing I wanted to ask you about, that I see all over the place in politics, and that's a complete lack of nuance and like a projection of a false dichotomy onto everybody that you interact with. So what I mean, the Rogan one's a good example. Um, if you say, I think Rogan was irresponsible in X, Y, and Z ways. I think that was harmful of him to do. And at the same time, I don't think Spotify should censor him. You end up pissing off like 90% of the room for some reason because people are stuck in their corners of the issue. Another example of this to me is how people respond on the left to progressive Democrats, right? You have crowds that think AOC is tantamount to Nancy Pelosi. And then you also have people who think AOC is going to save the whole world. And it's like, if you have this nuanced, hey, here I don't think she was strong enough and I'm going to be critical of her and I think she should have taken a stronger strategy, but on the by and large I think she's fighting for good things, or what, like that, taking a nuanced position seems to almost always piss off everybody. And it's like there's this total lack of willingness to detach from these false dichotomies and actually talk about the issues at hand.
That's interesting, and I'll tell you, I have a theory on why that's happening. And I think it's because there's an urge for community.
Mm-hmm.
That's why we're giving into tribal instincts, even if they're just wrong. So, like, people are forming tribes now, and like, are you in our tribe or you're outside of our tribe, right? I think
That's a
that's
great
because of
point.
that phenomenon we've been discussing this whole time about that urge to move out of the individual Reagan mode into like community mode, right? It's not a healthy thing. It's not a healthy expression of community, but it
Right.
is an expression of it, right? So, or the desire for it, right? And so how do you get out of that? Is that I think the only way to get out of that is you have one of those communities that forms is one that values nuance, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
that like, so for example, my political party in Australia, the Australian Progressives, we are like we have our one of our values is evidence, another is ethics, other is empathy, and it's a big part of what we were about. Is like having like calm, respectful discussions, along like that are broadly aligned with our values, right? And they happen like, and it took a long time to kind of fight for that culture. And externally, the organization does fight and fights hard, but internally, the culture is one which very much values and like that kind of, well, not just internally. I guess it's created a culture of like calm discourse, but I think that's also
Mm.
what we're fighting for externally, is saying, is that calm discourse. So it's like the very thing you're tribalizing around is rational discourse, right? If that makes sense. Like,
Mm-hmm.
say that should be part of all the tribes. They should all like, and because every tribe that's fighting and forming represents some interest that needs expression, right? Like, so for example, religious conservatives represent an interest in like having some sort of existential relationship with the universe that
Mm-hmm.
clearly is not represented by scientific type society. And that's I get that. I mean, I'm not a Christian, but I get that. And you know and I think that one of the things that progressives need to kind of fight for is that space for that sort of discourse. And that's going to be part of the features of our tribe as we develop it,
I
right?
like
And
the way you
saying
put
that,
that. You've talked a lot before about a lack of identity, that not just on the left, but among a lot of people in our modern society. And I wonder if people aren't kind of falling into that trap of like, I'm going to identify with like AOC's the devil, or AOC, or I'm going to identify with Joe Rogan's the devil. And it becomes something that you can sort of almost just virtue signal and get a response online, and now you feel like you're part of this community that is opposed to X, Y, or Z, or supports X, Y, or Z.
yeah, yeah. And I think like we've got to. It's it sounds funny. Like the last couple of minutes, we probably sounded like centrists, haven't we? We're,
My audience will
but
not be confused. Do not worry.
yeah, okay, good. No, but it's the thing is that no, I mean, I actually do believe that in the way that the political spectrum has shifted, that progressives are sort of poised to become like play the role of centrists. I think that people who we
Mm-hmm.
actually call centrists are actually now very much on one end of the spectrum, right?
Yes.
Because now if we define politics as you know, if we think, oh, I mean, we've had this discussion about the political compass, right? And you add the
Yes.
Z
Yeah.
axis of globalization, right?
Yeah.
So right, so I guess that the that's the point, though, is that like our identity as a group, we need to do that. Like progressives as a group needs to be the group, and I think we're the only ones actually able to. Like literally, no one else is able to, because as I said, like liberals are very much like it's that their mindset is like institutional. So the only their
Hmm.
solutions are we've got to reinforce the institution and like and keep people out of institutions who and use who don't agree and use institutional and I feel for them because they just don't have in their mindset any other solutions, right?
Yeah.
And then on the right is just everything that's opposed to those institutions and anything associated with, including like knowledge or common sense or like any shred of rationality, right? Like, you know, they must have cheated in the election because they are who they are. Like that's not a rational argument, right? So so we're the only ones who are like actually poised to play that role, right?
Hmm.
And so we've got to form our own community. We've got to strengthen it, and things like unions will be at the core of it. And we've got to grow our power so that those values, like a reasonable, a rational discourse, right, and the ability to accept multiple perspectives again, can actually, you know, stop this
Prevail.
country from
Yeah.
ripping its and stop it from
Yeah.
ripping itself apart. You know,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, hey, we could go on for hours and hours and hours, but I don't want to take up too much of your time. So, I thank you again for being here, Vinay. I'm sure that we'll talk again soon. I always appreciate your insights and the conversations that we have. So, really appreciate you taking the time, and look forward to next time.
likewise. Talk to you soon.